Well, this past week we wrapped up our Fam Jam, which is kind of like a VBS. If you're unfamiliar, but if you've been around, it's where families come and gather, and we spend 4 evenings together, and they play together, eat together, learn a little bit about God together, and we spend this time. And Fam Jam is important to us, and for all the volunteers, if you brought things in or you served us this past week, we just want to say thank you. It was an incredible week. Just amazing to see the number of people in here and the way that Fam Jam was celebrated and lived out. Our children's staff, if you had family here, our children's staff knocked it out of the park and led us well. These 4 days, yeah. It really was a pretty special 4 days. And so what we want to do now is we got a little highlight video we'd like to show you. That's part of the Jar Wars that we've done every year is they raise money. The children in the competition, you saw the children's staff being slimed. That was lovely. And what they do is they raise the money, and the kids get to put them in the different buckets, the money in the different buckets. They raised nearly $4,000 this week, and to help with crisis care kits, yeah. So just want to make you aware as you see this and as you sign up for next year, as we will come back to you next June and be ready to roll. And the theme of Fam Jam was 1 in a million. That's what we've carried out through this month in our teaching series. And when we began a few weeks ago, we wanted to make sure everybody understood they are 1 in a million, that you're not a number. You're loved. You're valued. You're not disposable. And your value is not determined. Your value is not determined by your possessions or what you do or what others say about you. Your value is that this Creator God separated man and woman from all the other creation and made man and woman with his hands. David went on to talk about in Psalm 139 that we were knitted together in our mother's womb. Then last week we continued and started talking about the opportunities, these God-given opportunities that are come before us in our lives. There's disruptions out of the ordinary, that opportunities that maybe Jesus puts right in our path, that just as you and I are 1 in a million, that the people we come in contact with, we believe that these are special moments, special opportunities for us to identify people in the same way. And our goal was to become aware of these special moments, that we could have some time, just like we told the story of Esther, that Mordecai says to her, for such a time as this, that maybe you have been put in this situation, this circumstance for just this time. So here's what we're going to do is we're kicking off today. And I admitted to the first service, so I'll tell you as well. The next few moments are going to be terribly awkward. It may be even a little embarrassing, but I'm coming clean to you. We're all in this together. If you're watching with us online, you can participate just by raising your hand in the room. And if it's just your family, maybe it's not near as embarrassing as it will be for all of us participating right now. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and we just got to come clean, be free. free and say if this applies to you. And if it does, just slip your hand up. No judgment. We're not mocking anybody. Maybe a little, but we'll see. Have you ever not been chosen first on the playground? Come on. There you go. I started off with an easy one, so we're all in it together, right? Okay. Have you ever not been chosen at all on the playground where they just said, we would rather just lose down a man than run the risk of you blowing the game for us? Yeah, okay. All right. Have you ever not been accepted into the college you applied for? You ever got a rejection letter? There you go. Okay. There you go. Have you ever failed a test? Oh, yeah. Now, yeah, that one was easy. Everybody's like, oh, yeah. Have you ever had to just retake a test? Like the teacher said, you were so bad. We're just going to give you another crack at this. Okay, yeah. That was the story of my life. Have you ever, from the moment you have memories to today, have you ever had your eye on a special someone and you asked them for a date and they said, no, I don't need a date with you. There you go. Okay, yeah, so there we go. Have you ever been denied a loan? Oh, yeah, okay, those hands went up a little, like, ooh, I don't want to admit that. Have you ever, now this is the one that kind of ticks me off, so I'll just go ahead and admit it to you. Have you ever been denied a credit card that they invited you in the mail to join? That just seems like dirty pool. I mean, you sent me a letter, asked me, then you saw where the money went. You're like, that's just not going to work. You are living below the standards in which we choose. So I am rejecting you of my formal request to have you join our family. It's terrible. Have you ever applied for the job you wanted and you instead got, we're just going to go in a different direction? Yeah, okay, yeah. So have you ever received, we just regret to inform you? Yeah. So now that we've kind of all admitted where we've failed, that everybody in the room now, you know what it's like to be passed over. You know what it's like to not qualify or to be overqualified. You know what it's like for someone to just look right through you and past you. And it hurts. Right? I mean, it hurts. No matter how you cut it up, and we laughed about it, but at the end of the day, it still hurts. Because people tend to have some criteria, or there's certain qualities that they are looking for, and maybe it's IQ, or it's looks, or it's male or female, it's whatever. They've got some predetermined expectations. Basically, they're lining things up for what they want. And that kind of goes counterintuitive to what we've learned the last few weeks about the qualities in which stick out to God. I mean, we talked about He made us. He knitted us together in our mother's womb. That our value is not increased or decreased based on our possessions or what we do or what other people say about us. We're loved. We're valued. But there have been times in our life where we've been passed over. There's been times in our life where we weren't chosen, where somebody just looked at us and said, you're not good enough, and moved on. And we've had to kind of deal with that. Well, there's a great story in the Old Testament about David. And David is mentioned more in the Bible than anybody else except for Jesus. His name comes up in the Old and New Testament about 1,000 times. And he is known as many things. He's known as a shepherd. He's known as a giant killer. He's known as a warrior. He's known as a king. He's a musician. He's a writer. He's a father. He's a husband. He's a son. But David was also passed over. David was also passed over. In fact, he was so passed over. David was so passed over, he wasn't even invited to the meeting about being passed over. David was so passed over. He not only not invited to that meeting, he didn't even know there was a meeting. There was a gathering taking place over here with his brothers and his father and the prophet priest of Israel, and David is way out in the field by himself. He didn't even know all of this was happening. That's how passed over he was. And I guess that's safe. If you didn't know you're being passed over, it probably feels a little better. But what's happening in the history of Israel right now is there has been a gap of time where they are void of leadership. There's a gap of time they're void of leadership. And they had cried out they wanted a king, and Saul, God had given them Saul as their king, and for a time that worked out good. And he couldn't stay king because of his disobedience. And Saul was loved and valued, and God chose him. And just because you are loved doesn't mean you get a get-out-of-jail-free card. There's always consequences for sin. Always. We can't avoid that. And God sends Samuel, this priest and prophet of the nation, to confront him. Which everybody loves confronting the king, right? And that's what we got to do. So we're going to read 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 13. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of this people because you have not kept the Lord's command. So Samuel has got to come and give Saul bad news. He's basically telling him, you're not going to last. Your kingdom is not going to flourish. And typically in the line of royalty, that there was this opportunity where your children, your sons, would become the future kings. And he was saying, that's over. Your children are done. The line ends here. But there's one out there that's after God's own heart. And he goes ahead and he breaks the news. Now, at this moment in time, there would have been some challenges because now Samuel is telling the king, you're no longer going to be king. And that never goes well. That's always going to be a little bit of a challenge. And he tells him, and Samuel, it says, goes into mourning. He mourns, he grieves for Israel. He grieves for Saul. He grieves for what's happening. And he goes into a time of mourning, but then he's told to go to Bethlehem. 1 Samuel 16:1. So then the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you mourn for Saul, since I've rejected him as king over Israel? So how long are you going to do this? Now fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I'm sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. Now this has got to be a little scary because Israel has a king. And Samuel, who has just told Saul the bad news that you're done, is now being told to go pick the new king. And I'm going to tell you, God's going to give you the words. He's going to give you the wisdom on who to choose. Kings, like we said, like to stay kings. And so picking someone else, the people would have realized there was a little bit of a rift here. And while Saul is still in the palace, this is going to be hard. This is basically treason. This is basically treason. It would have been a challenge, and it would have been a hardship for the one that's chosen. It would have been hard for Samuel. It would have been hard for everybody. But Israel was a real mess. I mean, they had the old stories about Moses and Joshua and the exploits of what they did and their leadership and where they had led the tribe. But they were really a ship without a rudder. It's been about 300 years since the end of Joshua to the time of Samuel. And they are basically leaderless. And they wanted a king. The people were crying out, we need a king. All the other countries have kings. All the other nations have kings. All the other kingdoms have kings. We don't. We need a king. If we're going to be taken respectful, if people are really going to give us our credit, who we are, we need to have a king. So God grants him a king, gives him Saul, and he turns. He was not who he said he was. And Saul's poor leadership has led Israel in disarray. In Judges 21:25, it says, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit. And Israel has more problems. Israel's got more problems. They got the Philistines. And the Philistines are bearing down on the Israelites. And the Philistines were big, bad, and mad. They were known for their size. They were builders of iron and steel weapons. They fortified their cities. They were just known as giants amongst the other people. And there was one that was particularly big, this Goliath, that you probably have heard the story of how David battles Goliath later on. But as a people, they were makers. They were builders, and they took care of things. They built these massive weapons. Israel was hated. They hated Israel. They hated the Israelites. They just wanted to eradicate them from earth. And Israel, as much as the Philistines are flourishing, Israel is really just scraping by. They're doing everything they can just to survive. They're living in huts and sleeping on ground. They're not fortified cities at all. And weapons are scarce. In fact, if you read in one of the earlier chapters in 1 Samuel, that Saul and his son Jonathan go into a battle, and there's only 2 swords. They have one of each. And they're in this battle. So a lot of times they were using weapons that would have been considered more of juvenile, like slingshots and bows. And now the leadership of Saul is corrupt. Saul looks the part. He looks the part. He looks good. He was big. He was tall. He was handsome. He was wise. He'd carried himself well. And people believed in Saul because of the way he looked. But his heart wasn't good. 1 Samuel 16:4 says this. Samuel did what the Lord said, and when he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. And they asked, "Do you come in peace?" And Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." And then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. And when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed. He stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart." So Samuel does what God tells him. He goes to Bethlehem, and the people says they're trembling. They want to know, because they would have heard the stories. They would have known there's a rift between Saul and Samuel. They would have known that if he's there, either he's out looking for someone, or possibly Saul's got an army on the way. And if it looks like they are hosting him, that they could have been a part of the treason. They could have been a part of this act of defiance. They could have been. So they got to know, why are you here? He says, "I come in peace." And Bethlehem was kind of considered like the least of these towns. It was a little sleepy village. Nobody really cared about it. Nothing good kind of comes from it. And they didn't really, the prophet Micah called it just small and insignificant. And why would Samuel come here? Why would Samuel show up in Bethlehem? And it did bring fear to the people. It brought fear of what was coming. They had heard the stories and they knew. Everybody's life, it's here, is in a little bit of jeopardy, and it's a recipe for disaster. So, in the sports world, there's a phrase that gets used. When I was coaching for a while, when we would pull up to get out to whoever we were going to play in sports, when I was coaching, we would put the biggest kid we had to get off the bus first. You just want to set the tone because the other people are watching. The home team, when you roll up, they're watching. We want to send the biggest kid we got to just let everybody know this is what they expect. The little phrase that's used is, "That kid looked good getting off the bus." That kid looked good getting off the bus. Now, the problem is a lot of times if you look good getting off the bus, you can't play with a flip. But they don't need to know that. All we wanted them to see is there's a kid getting off the bus that looks pretty good. And this is kind of what they're saying. When Saul was looking at the sons of Jesse coming through, he would have went, "They look good getting off the bus. Those are a good-looking bunch. Huge, strong. You want them." And so the rest of this happens, verse 8 through 10. Then Jesse called Abinab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." And then Jesse said, "That has Shammah passed?" But Samuel said, "Nor the Lord has chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." 7 pass by, 7 keep walking. Surely one of them could have carried the mantle as king. Then verse 11. So Samuel asked Jesse, are these all the sons you got? Is this it? And Jesse answers, they're still the youngest. He's tending the sheep. And Samuel said, send for him. We're not going to even sit down until he arrives. So he sent for him, had him brought in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. And the Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and he anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. And Samuel then went to Ramah. Now Samuel had to wonder. I mean, if you're in Samuel's shoes and you got 7 that look good getting off the bus and they're walking by, you got to start thinking, maybe I messed up. Maybe I had them walk by too fast. So maybe it's not even recorded, but maybe he says, all right, we need to do this one more time. I need you guys all to walk by and just walk slower. I need to give you the eyeball test one more time because maybe God took a break or something and he missed it and you walked by and missed the shot. Let's just look at this one more time because these are the 7 that look the best getting off the bus, and that's what we need. I mean, maybe I just skipped over too quickly. Maybe I'm not listening to God. Maybe what is we looking for here? So when he asks, are there more? Are there more? Is there somebody else? Maybe Samuel's thinking, maybe there's another one that's been outside and we just missed it. Jesse goes, no, I've got one more. He's out in the field. He's the youngest. Now, the youngest here, the word, it's a little different. So, I mean, while the rest of the brothers are in town with dad, we talked about this. He wasn't even invited to the gathering. He didn't even know there was a gathering. David was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, while the rest of the brothers were talking with Samuel, the priest prophet of all of Israel, David's probably talking to sheep. I mean, he's out there by himself with a herd of sheep. I mean, he's probably like, bah, what are you doing? I've worked on that. That was good. Come on. Bah, it was bad. I was an only child. I had to entertain myself. Talk to my hand a lot. I mean, he's got the lowest job working with the dumbest animal on the ranch. By himself out in the field. With the lowest rank in the family. I mean, he was not even invited to the celebration or the sacrifice. This Hebrew word that's used here is hakaton. It doesn't just mean the youngest. It means insignificant one. It means bottom of the barrel. It's the same word that they use in the Hebrew for your pinky finger that says, basically, you could live without it. You don't need it. That's what they're talking about here. So when Samuel sees David and says, this is the one, he anoints him and the Spirit of God comes down on him. I mean, this is unbelievable. Because the brothers would have all known what everybody else thought of David. Insignificant. Passed over. Not needed. Go far away, take care of the sheep, while we'll take care of the business. We're going to take care of what's important with the prophet of God. We're going to take care of what's important with the business with dad in town. We're going to take care of what's valuable, what means the most to us. You, David, that is your name, right, David? Yeah, you go out there. You take care of that. That's where we're at. So how does this apply to us? How does this come back around to where you and I are living? We've been talking about this 1 in a million. Here it is. God sees you. See, I believe that when David wrote Psalm 139, we don't really know the exact timeline of when this happened, but we know he was this young shepherd boy. We know there's a time, and then he is anointed king, and he takes over as ruler. that I believe there was a time after being anointed king that he probably went up as the sun was to begin to break over Jerusalem, and he's looking out over Israel, that he says, sitting up there, and he remembers the words that maybe him and Samuel had to talk about, like, Samuel, how'd you pick me? I mean, before Samuel walks to Ramah, he's probably like, why would you pick me? And he said, David, God said there's one after his own heart, and he chose you because of that. But if I'm David, I'm going, but what about Shammah? What about Abinadab? I mean, those guys, they had it going on. They were big, they were strong, they were mean, they were fast, they were leaders. They were all these things, but you picked me. And he would have said, God doesn't look at any of that. God saw your heart, and that's all he needed. So I believe there's a point in time while David is king, he crawls up on top of this hillside, he watches the sun come up, and he begins to write what he's been told by the prophet of God about how God feels about him. And he goes, you know me. You know me. You know everything about me. You knitted me together in my mother's womb, and you know me. And this was firsthand knowledge, because I got to believe, if you are watching with us online or you're sitting in this room right now, that when we started talking about what a hackathon was, you were going, that's me. It's me and my family. That's me in my workplace. That's me in our home. That's me. That you started to say, that's me. And you started maybe even going through your minds thinking, I remember when I wasn't picked first. I remember when I wasn't picked at all, or I didn't make the team, or I didn't make the cut, or the interview didn't go well, and they told me I'm going to go in a different direction, or I was denied or abandoned. Or maybe when you saw your neighbors getting together and you're sitting in the front room and you begin to dream about, I've been in the field of nowhere, full of nobodies, watching sheep. And maybe you started to swell up with some emotions, and you started kind of feeling like, why do I have? And then we got to fast forward over to John chapter 15 when Jesus is telling his disciples, and know this, I choose you. I choose you. So maybe today, what you need to hear, that you are loved. You are valuable. You are not disposable at all. That this Creator God who knits you together in your mother's womb chooses you. And he knows you, not because of anything you bring to the table, not because of anything you bring to the table. He doesn't care about your possessions. He doesn't care what other people say about you. He doesn't even care what you do. He chooses you because he loves you. He loves you silly.